And so I believe they had this technology. And so Enlil's all-seeing eye, I believe, is the Black Knight satellite, which is why I did the documentary. And so the deeper I dug into this, the more I looked into it, the more I began to realize a lot of structures on Earth that have these astronomical calculations and crazy star alignment from stars that are, 100 light years away, a million light years away, and all these crazy, outrageous numbers. I realized it takes technology, and one of the technologies that they had was a satellite orbiting in a polar orbit. Now, what's interesting is we couldn't do a polar orbit until more modern times. We just learned how to put satellites in a polar orbit. We just learned how to do that. The Dogon tribe knew about Sirius B, and they knew about this in ancient times. They knew about this uh, uh, long before we even had the capability of creating observatories. They had a verbal handed down history for thousands of years that the Nomo came from a planet that orbited Sirius B, which is a star that ran out of fuel. They came to Earth and they began. These are Nomo are Anunnaki people. They came to Earth and they taught them the orbital periods of their trinary star system, Sirius. They taught them all the information about the planets in our solar system, the shapes, the sizes, the colors, and the orbital periods. I'm sorry. And so they had all this advanced wisdom they claimed they got from the Nomo. Okay. And they still have that same exact history till this current day. These Nomo taught them about Adinkra codes. And they would then take these Adinkra codes and they would create different patterns on clothing, material, and even in construction. And these Adinkra codes are actually codes that are the mathematical codes that make up space-time, the ether of space-time itself. And that was recently discovered that the codes that the Dogon have been writing down on different types of clothing and materials and blankets and so forth, and in caves and etching into stone, those are the codes that create the ether of space-time itself. Now, those are the program codes of the matrix. They know the program codes of the actual matrix. And this was proven by Professor James Gates Jr., who discovered that these Adinkra codes are mathematical codes that are called error correcting codes, and that these error correcting codes, after analyzing them, are the same exact codes that predict the operation of how the flow of the universe actually functions. In other words, the underlying basis of the functioning of our reality are Adinkra codes that the Dogon tribe holds sacred and knew all about for thousands of years. And they knew about a star that we couldn't see till modern times for thousands of years. And they've passed it down, this verbal handed down history for many, many generations. So the fact that this information can be passed down, this knowledge and wisdom can be passed down over many generations is not a secret. It's not a mystery. We know that for a fact that these kinds of things actually happen. And so this all-seeing eye and the information that it was able to use to calculate, to create things like the Great Pyramid and many other ancient structures all around the planet, to me, it's our time to learn about it. It's our time to wake up to the reality that there was a more sophisticated, advanced civilization here on this planet long before we ever existed, long before Homo sapien existed. And now we're just beginning to realize or rediscover what was already here. And so this all-seeing eye is pretty amazing because it ties into a few other things. So this Black Knight satellite was detected by a signal coming from the Black Knight satellite was detected by Nikola Tesla. Okay, Nikola Tesla in the early 1900s. And he actually made a statement that he thought that these signals, and I remember at that time, there should have been nothing making any kind of noise in space. Nothing should be, no information was being transmitted yet on this planet. He thought that these signals were coming from Mars. See, Tesla was working on radio communications back then. And he started picking up a frequency, a signal coming from something. He thought it could have been an alien civilization living on Mars. Actually, it was the Black Knight satellite giving out the signal. The frequencies that he recorded are the same exact frequencies recorded in the 1950s by two ham radio operators, which made mainstream news. They had detected this signal. They had begun to decode the signal. It was giving the location of a star system called the Epsilon Bootis, and a constellation. And then in 1960, another astronomer who was a writer for Time magazine, Duncan Lunan, he actually then decoded the signal as well. He wrote about it, and it made Time magazine in 1960. Interesting. So I'm saying, man, this is pretty interesting stuff. This is like multiple sources getting the same signal, and the translation of this signal coming up virtually almost the same. They were talking about the Epsilon Boötis constellation, but where it was in the sky potentially between 11 and 13,000 years ago, based on precession of the equinoxes. So this thing could be super ancient. This device that's up there orbiting our planet in a polar orbit, which shouldn't even be able to happen for thousands of years, could be about 11 to 13,000 years old. So I said, this is pretty interesting. So this device that's up there could be the all-seeing eye of Enlil. I said, let me look a little bit deeper. What does Enlil have to do with Epsilon? So I start digging and digging and digging, and I find out that Epsilon is actually owned, according to the Sumerian tablets, Epsilon is owned by Enlil. Yeah, he owns it. It's his constellation. The star Boötis is his star, meaning he probably comes from that sector of the galaxy. He probably came from a planet that orbits that star. Enlil, Mesopotamian god of the atmosphere, and a member of the triad of gods, the original, this triad. There was three of them. It was Enlil, Enki, and Anu. That's the Trinity. That's where the Trinity actually originally came from. Let us make man in our image. That was said by Enki, his brother. That wasn't said by God. That wasn't said by the creator of the universe that you think said it. It was said by Ea Enki, the person that the earth is named after. Ea is his first name, Ea. Ki meaning earth. That's the ancient translation into earth. Earth is named after this Anunnaki. So if you had any doubts about who the Anunnaki were, the planet you're on is named after one of them. And Enki is the one who said, let us make man in our image. That made it into the biblical text that came from the Anunnaki. Enlil's brother. Enlil meant Lord, wind. Both the hurricane and the gentle winds of the spring were thought of as the breath issuing from his mouth, and eventually his word or command. He was sometimes called Lord of the air. He was also called Satan, the Lord of Eden. Sound familiar, guys? Sound familiar? In the Bible, he's known as Yahweh. Sound familiar? Sound familiar? His son is named Marduk, who's also in the Bible. Look it up. Marduk. Who's Marduk? His other name was Amun-Ra. And he's the one who said, when you say amen, you say, anytime you give thanks, you say amen. You give thanks to me. So that's where amen actually originates. It originates from Enlil's and Enki's bloodline. And you're saying thank you to these Anunnaki, which have you say amen. That's a whole nother podcast though. But anyway,